She is running barefoot through a Manhattan hallway at midnight, and the man chasing her was once the person she trusted most. 6 months of hiding. 6 months of new locks, new routes, new routines built around surviving his obsession. 6 months of convincing herself it was finally over. It wasn't over. It was never over. And now, at the end of this empty corridor, the only door left open belongs to a man whose name makes federal prosecutors lose sleep. A man whose empire is built on silence, violence, and the kind of power that doesn't answer to anyone. She has 2 seconds to decide. Run back toward the monster she knows, or step inside the cage with the one she doesn't. The elevator doors begin to close. She jumps in. If you've ever had to choose between 2 dangers and prayed you picked the right one, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The charity gala had been Nyla Hartwell's idea of a necessary evil. She hadn't wanted to go. She told herself that 3 times while standing in front of her bathroom mirror, smoothing the deep burgundy fabric of her dress over her hips, telling herself the slight tremble in her hands was just the cold and not the low-grade terror that had become the permanent weather system of her life. She told herself it again in the cab uptown, watching Midtown's towers slide past the rain-slicked window like the skyline was trying to escape something too. And she'd told herself a 3rd time at the entrance to the Aldrich Grand Hotel, handing her coat to a man in white gloves who smiled the practiced smile of someone paid to make the wealthy feel welcomed. The Meridian Foundation Gala. One of those events that existed to launder guilt. Wealthy people writing checks so they could stop thinking about the distance between their penthouses and the people who cleaned them. Nyla knew the type. She'd spent 11 years as a forensic auditor dismantling the financial architectures those same people built. And she'd learned early that the more expensive the event, the more expensive the secrets it was designed to distract from. She was there because her firm's senior partner, Gerald Whitmore, had called her personally that afternoon. Attendance isn't optional this cycle, Nyla. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who delivered bad news with the energy of a grocery list. We have 3 clients presenting at the gala. Your presence communicates stability, discretion, competence. She hadn't argued. Arguing with Gerald cost more energy than it returned. So she went. The ballroom was everything Manhattan money could manufacture in a single room. 20-foot ceilings dressed in soft gold light, crystal chandeliers that caught every movement and refracted it into small explosions of brightness, round tables clothed in white linen where conversations about philanthropy moved comfortably alongside conversations about quarterly returns. A jazz quartet occupied the northeast corner of the room, working through a Cole Porter standard with the resigned professionalism of musicians who had long since made their peace with being background noise at other people's celebrations. Nyla had done 2 circuits of the room in the first 40 minutes, exchanged brief and forgettable pleasantries with 2 of Whitmore's clients, accepted a glass of sparkling water she didn't drink, and spent the remaining time near the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Midtown skyline, far enough from the crowd to breathe, close enough to the room that Gerald couldn't call it antisocial. She was watching the rain track down the glass when she felt it. That particular stillness in the back of her neck, that cold, specific pressure between her shoulder blades she hadn't felt in 6 months and would have been happy to never feel again. She didn't turn around immediately. She'd learned, the hard way, in the months before she finally left, that turning around gave him what he wanted. Acknowledgement. Confirmation that his presence moved through her like current through wire. So she kept her eyes on the window and did the thing her therapist had taught her. She named what she could see. Rain. Streetlights. A yellow cab paused at a red light 20 stories below. A woman in a green coat walking fast with her head down. Normal things. Real things. Things that existed outside of him. Then someone laughed too loudly 2 tables to her left, and in the brief turning of heads that followed, she saw the reflection in the glass. Brennan Voss was standing 40 feet away looking directly at her. Her stomach dropped so fast and so completely that for a moment she forgot she was standing. He looked the same. That was the obscene part of it. He looked entirely, offensively, completely the same. The same strong jaw, the same expensive haircut, the same suit that had probably cost more than her monthly rent. He was holding a champagne glass, and he was looking at her, and his expression was not the expression of a man surprised to see someone. It was the expression of a man who had known she would be there. She moved before her thoughts caught up with her feet. She set the water glass down on the windowsill, which was either composed or mechanical, she genuinely didn't know which, and turned away from his reflection and started walking. Not running. Not yet. Running would create a scene, and scenes created witnesses, and witnesses meant questions, and questions were the last thing she needed when she was still 6 months into rebuilding a life that had been systematically disassembled by the man currently tracking her across a ballroom. She moved toward the south end of the room, weaving through clusters of guests, keeping her shoulders even, keeping her breathing measured. She was a forensic auditor. She understood complex systems. She could navigate a ballroom. She glanced back once. He was following. Not aggressively, not obviously, just following, with the patient, deliberate efficiency of a man who had done this before, who had walked through rooms after her before, who had learned over 18 months of a relationship that had progressively revealed itself to be something much closer to captivity, exactly how she moved when she was afraid. She pushed through a service door near the back of the ballroom. The corridor beyond it was narrow and utilitarian. Exposed pipe along the ceiling, industrial carpet, the smell of cleaning products and kitchen exhaust. She was moving faster now, her heels striking the floor in quick, sharp notes that bounced back at her off the walls, and she was thinking about exits and thinking about her phone and thinking about the fact that she had blocked Brandon's number 6 months ago and changed her apartment and changed her gym and changed the route she walked to the subway every morning, and he was still here, he was still in the same room. He had somehow found her again in a city of 8 million people at a private event. She'd only decided to attend that afternoon. She rounded a corner. Another corridor, longer, better lit. At the far end, a bank of elevators with brushed gold doors, private access by the look of the keypad panel alongside them. VIP floors. She didn't care. She just needed a door between herself and him. She heard the service entrance swing open behind her. She didn't look back. She just ran. Her heels snapped against the marble floor, and then one gave out, the left heel catching a seam in the stone and snapping clean off at the ankle. And she stumbled, caught herself against the wall, and kept moving. She kicked off both shoes without stopping, left them behind without a second thought, and ran the last 40 feet of corridor on bare feet, the marble cold and hard against her soles, her dress gathered in one fist to keep from tripping, her heart doing something that wasn't quite beating so much as detonating in irregular bursts against her ribs. She hit the elevator call button with the heel of her palm. The panel lit. She pressed herself against the wall beside the doors and forced herself to breathe. Slow, measured, deliberate, and listened. Footsteps. Behind her. Maybe 30 feet. Moving with purpose. Not running. He never ran. He'd told her once that running was for people who hadn't thought ahead. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. She threw herself inside. Spun. Hit the door close button 3 times in rapid succession, the way people do when they know it won't work any faster, but can't stop their hands from trying. The doors began to slide shut. She saw him at the end of the corridor, walking fast now, finally, his expression hardening as he saw her, his hand coming up, reaching forward, and then the gap between the doors was 6 inches, then 3, then closed. She let out a sound she didn't intend to make. Something between a breath and a sob, pressed out of her by pure relief. Then she registered that she was not alone. She had been watching the doors. She hadn't looked at the elevator's interior at all. She turned now, and the relief that had just flooded her body did something complicated. Not exactly evaporating, but rearranging itself into something much more difficult to name. The man standing in the back corner of the elevator was tall. Not just tall in the way of someone who stood straight, tall in the way of someone who occupied space differently than ordinary people, as though the dimensions of the room had quietly reorganized themselves around him. He wore a black suit that had no visible label, but that communicated its expense through the way it held still even when he moved. Dark hair, clean jaw, the kind of face that was handsome the way a blade was handsome, precise, cold, built for function rather than warmth. He was watching her with eyes the color of deep water in low light, and his expression had not changed at all since she'd come crashing through the doors. Nyla was breathing hard. Her feet were bare. Her dress was wrinkled where she'd been gripping it. She had no shoes, no handbag. She'd left it on a table in the ballroom 3 minutes ago, which meant no phone, no ID, no anything. Her hair, which she'd spent 40 minutes arranging, had partially come free on one side and was hanging near her jaw. She was, by any objective measure, a complete disaster. The man said nothing. She said nothing. The elevator moved. Up. "I'm sorry," Nyla said finally, because the silence was becoming something physical. I needed to." She stopped. Tried again. "Someone was following me." The man looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were steady in a way that made her feel simultaneously examined and, oddly, inexplicably less afraid than she'd been 30 seconds ago, which was strange because nothing about him suggested she should feel less afraid. "I know," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying a faint accent she couldn't immediately locate. Somewhere Eastern European, softened by years of something else. She blinked. "You... what?" "The man in the gray suit. He's been circling the ballroom for approximately 40 minutes. He paused. "Watching you." She stared at him. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things." The elevator slowed. Stopped. The doors opened onto a floor that was not a hotel floor in the way the floors below it had been. There was no corridor of numbered rooms, no ice machine, no generic artwork chosen to offend no one. There was a short entryway, a double door of dark wood, and a security panel. A man in a dark suit who stood near the door and whose posture communicated military training with the efficiency of a resume. The man from the elevator stepped out without looking back at her. He paused, glanced over his shoulder. "Are you coming?" he said. Not an invitation, not quite a command, something in between. A door held open and a clock ticking simultaneously. Nyla thought about the lobby. She thought about Brandon in the corridor, waiting, because he would be waiting. He was very good at waiting. She thought about her phone in her purse on a table in the ballroom and the fact that she had no one to call who could have gotten to the Aldrich Grand Hotel faster than Brandon could have found her. She stepped out of the elevator. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the hotel's East Tower, which Nyla learned only later was not a standard suite but a privately maintained residence that the hotel's management company listed in no directory and mentioned in no promotional material. It was the kind of arrangement that required certain agreements between certain parties, and a great deal of money flowing in a specific direction. She learned a lot of things in the next 2 hours. The space itself was extraordinary in the way of things that were not designed to impress, which made them more impressive than the things that were. Floor-to-ceiling windows along 3 walls, the Manhattan skyline spread below like a circuit board left on overnight. Furniture that was expensive and spare, chosen for quality rather than display. Books on actual shelves, a kitchen that had been used. A lack of fresh flowers, which struck her later as notable because every wealthy space she'd ever entered had been aggressively floral in the way of spaces staged for photographs. This one was lived in. The security man, whose name she never got, brought her a glass of water and a small plate of food she didn't touch, and then withdrew with the competence of someone trained to be absent exactly when absent was required. The man sat across from her in a low chair. "Cassian Volkov," he said, not introducing himself so much as correcting an assumption she hadn't yet made. The name moved through her like cold water. She knew the name. She knew it the way people in financial industries knew it. Not from headlines, because Cassian Volkov didn't appear in headlines, which was itself the most significant thing about him. She knew it from the specific quality of silence that entered a room when it was mentioned, from the careful way colleagues changed subjects. From a single case study she'd reviewed 3 years ago, a Shell Corporation audit that had abruptly closed when 3 federal investigators requested reassignment within the same week and no official explanation was ever offered. She knew what he was. "Nyla Hartwell," she said, because what else was there? "I know who you are," he said. She watched him. "How?" "You work for Whitmore Forensic Partners. You've been employed there for 7 years. You specialize in offshore trust structures and encrypted financial networks. You have an apartment on the Upper West Side that you moved into 6 months ago. Before that, you lived on Riverside Drive." He paused. "With Brandon Voss." The name in his mouth produced a specific kind of cold. "Why do you know any of that?" she said. It came out flat, not a question. "Because 3 weeks ago," Cassian said, "I discovered that someone had stolen $3 million from my financial reserves. He held her gaze. The trail leads to Brandon Voss, and the credential trail he used to hide it leads to you. The room was very quiet. Rain tracked down the glass behind him. That's not possible, Nyla said. I thought the same thing when I first saw the audit. He leaned forward slightly. Then I saw it a second time. She was already running through it in her head. The architecture of what he was describing, the plausibility of it, the technical shape of how something like that would have to work. Access credentials, network pathways, the specific kind of forensic trail that pointed at an identity rather than the physical person behind it. She'd built cases on structures like that. She'd also dismantled them. He had access to my work credentials, she said slowly. The knowledge moved through her like something already half understood surfacing from deep water. There was a period, before I left, when he would sometimes use my home system. I thought he was just working. He was always working, he said. He was always... She stopped. She thought about the 6 months, the new apartment, the changed routes, the careful, painstaking architecture of a life rebuilt to keep one person out of it. She thought about this ballroom tonight, about the 40 minutes of circling, about the fact that she'd only decided to come to this event that afternoon, and somehow he had been there. He wasn't following me because of the relationship, she said. Cassian said nothing, which was confirmation. He was following me because I'm the only person who could prove he used my credentials, and if someone started investigating the money, she heard her own voice come apart slightly at the edges and pulled it back. The forensic trail leads to me, which means I'm either the person who can clear the record or the person who takes the fall. Yes, Cassian said, and he needed to make sure I couldn't do either. Yes. She put the water glass down on the table in front of her because her hands needed something to do, and she wasn't going to let them shake. She looked out at the skyline. 8 million people in this city. She had spent 6 months being afraid of a man she thought had been destroyed by jealousy and possessive anger and whatever dysfunction he'd been building toward in those final months before she left. He hadn't been falling apart. He'd been managing a liability. She had been the loose end. "What is it you want from me?" she said. Cassian studied her for a moment. "The money is hidden inside a structure I've been unable to decode. Whoever built it understood advanced offshore trust architecture." He paused. "You're one of 4 people in this country who could dismantle it. And the other 3? Unavailable." She looked at him. "That's a convenient word." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, cold and brief. "I need the money located and recovered. I need the credential evidence linking the theft to Voss rather than you properly documented and secured. And I need it done before the federal inquiry that was opened on that shell network 2 weeks ago gets close enough to see your name on the access logs." "There's a federal inquiry." "There is." "How long do I have? Based on current progress of the investigation?" He considered. 11 days, possibly 10. Nyla was quiet. She thought about her firm, about Gerald Whitmore's carefully blank face whenever her name appeared in connection with anything that carried legal weight, about the 7 years she'd spent building a reputation for exactness and integrity in an industry where both were perpetually in short supply. She thought about Brandon Voss standing in a ballroom corridor with a champagne glass, and the patient, deliberate expression of a man running a calculation. "If I help you recover the money," she said carefully, "what happens to me? The evidence trail showing your credentials were used without authorization is documented and preserved. Any federal inquiry that develops your name as a suspect will hit a wall." He paused. "You walk away clean. And if I say no?" He didn't answer immediately. "If you say no," he said finally, "you walk out of this building tonight and handle your situation as you see fit. I won't stop you." He looked at her steadily. "But Brandon Voss is still in this hotel, and federal investigators don't require your cooperation to build a case." Not a threat, just the shape of the world as it actually was. She looked at her hands. She looked at the rain on the glass. She thought about the specific, precise, particular way she had felt standing in the elevator corridor with her bare feet on cold marble and no phone and no shoes and the sound of footsteps behind her. And she thought about the fact that the fear hadn't come from nowhere, that it had been being manufactured for months by a man who had needed her afraid and isolated and unable to clearly see the shape of what he'd done. "Show me the structure," she said. They worked through the night. Cassian's security team, 3 men whose names she collected and filed mentally as she did with all professional information, set up a workstation in the penthouse's secondary room. 2 monitors. Encrypted connection. The financial architecture of Brandon's shell network loaded in layers that Nyla peeled back with the methodical patience she'd spent a decade developing. It was, she had to admit, impressive work. Not brilliant, but impressively careful. The kind of structure built by someone who had done enough research to understand how forensic auditors thought and had designed obstructions accordingly. False pathways that looked like errors but were deliberate misdirection. Credential logs layered over genuine transaction records, the whole thing assembled with the painstaking attention of a man who had understood that the only way to hide money from someone who found hidden money for a living was to make the hiding look like incompetence. It almost worked, but almost was a gap, and gaps were what Nyla did. Cassian came in and out of the room. He didn't hover. He didn't ask questions about what she was doing or suggest approaches or offer opinions. He brought her coffee at some point, black, which wasn't how she drank it, but she drank it anyway. And he read documents at the table beside the window. And when she said something aloud to herself, which was a habit she'd never managed to break, he occasionally looked up. Around 3 in the morning, she said, "He's been planning this for longer than I thought." Cassian set down whatever he was reading. "How long?" "The earliest credential access I can see is 14 months ago." She turned to look at him. "We were still together then." "I hadn't started looking for apartments yet." She paused. "He was already building this while we were still—" She stopped. "You couldn't have known," Cassian said. "Don't." The word came out harder than she intended. "Don't do the thing where you tell me it wasn't my fault. I'm not looking for that." She turned back to the screen. "I'm telling you because it's relevant to the timeline." A pause. "Understood," he said. She hadn't expected that. Most people, men in particular, in her experience, pushed back on rejection of comfort the way they pushed back on rejection of most things they'd offered. Cassian simply adjusted, filed the new information, moved on. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she filed it away and kept working. By dawn, she had mapped 4 of the 6 layers of the network. The money was moving through 3 different jurisdictions, 2 of which she'd identified, and the final holding structure had the fingerprints of a Swiss trust arrangement she'd dismantled a variant of 4 years ago in a corporate espionage case. She recognized the architecture the way you recognized a recurring lie, not from the specific words but from the underlying shape. "The final layer is in Geneva," she said. "I can't confirm the institution without a specific access credential, but based on the trust structure I'm seeing, it's one of 4 banks, probably 2. She leaned back in the chair, rolled her neck. "If you have contacts in Swiss banking, and I assume you do, we can narrow it down by morning." Cassian was already on his phone, speaking in what she thought was Russian. Brief sentences, the kind of conversation that communicated more through what wasn't said than through what was. He ended the call. "We'll have confirmation within 3 hours." "Then I need to sleep," she said. 2 hours minimum. I'll make mistakes otherwise." He showed her to a room, clean, simple. A window that looked north toward the park, dark and enormous in the pre-dawn quiet. She lay down on top of the covers in her dress and was unconscious before she'd finished the thought she'd started about whether she should take it off. She slept without dreaming, which was the first time in 6 months that had been true. The morning brought confirmation from Cassian's contact. The Geneva institution was identified. The trust structure was exactly what she'd suspected. She worked through the protocol for accessing and reversing the transfer with the focused efficiency of someone who had slept 2 hours on top of a day's worth of adrenaline and had nothing left to spend on hesitation. Cassian worked alongside her, not on the financial architecture, which was her territory, but on the parallel operational logistics, which were clearly his. He had a particular way of managing multiple streams of information simultaneously that she found herself watching occasionally when she should have been watching her screen. He caught her looking once. Neither of them said anything about it. The thing between them wasn't spoken. It wasn't even close to spoken. It was the specific, dangerous thing that sometimes grew between people forced into proximity by high stakes and long hours. The thing that felt like recognition and might have been nothing more than shared exhaustion. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the drop past the windows. Clearly, precisely, without any illusion about what it would mean to step toward it carelessly. By early afternoon, she had the recovery protocol assembled and ready. One execution command away from reversing the entire transfer and routing the funds back to Cassian's accounts. The digital trail documenting Brandon's credential theft was already secured and formatted for legal use. She sat back. "Ready," she said. Cassian was across the table from her. He was looking at his phone. The quality of his attention had shifted. She'd been reading him for 24 hours by that point, and she'd gotten good at the small signals. Something had come through on his phone that he was now processing behind a completely still face. "Cassian," she said. He looked up. "Ready," she said again. He nodded. "Execute it." She did. The protocol ran in 17 seconds. The money moved, the documentation sealed. 11 years of work and what felt like all of her available nerve compressed into 17 seconds. And then the screen showed a confirmation code, and it was done. She exhaled. And then Cassian's security man came through the door, the one she'd mentally filed as the senior position, whose name she'd since learned was Damon, and said 4 words with the flat efficiency of someone delivering operational intelligence. "He's still in the building." She heard the sentence and felt the temperature in the room change. "Brandon," she said, "he bribed 2 members of the hotel staff last night. He has access to the security camera feeds on floors 12 through 24. He's been using a service entrance." Damon looked at Cassian, not at her. "He's been in the building the entire time. He's currently 2 floors down." Nyla looked at her hands on the keyboard. 2 floors down. She had been here for 18 hours. She had slept in this building. She had done the most concentrated work of her professional life in this building. And 2 floors down, Brandon Voss had been patient in the specific, deliberate way he was always patient. And he had been waiting, and he had been watching, and she had been so absorbed in the work and in the man sitting across from her that she had made the precise mistake her therapist had spent months helping her understand was her primary vulnerability. She had believed she was safe because the door between her and the danger had closed. "What do you want to do?" she said to Cassian. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Cassian put his phone face down on the table. "Bring him up," he said to Damon. Nyla's head came around fast. "No." Cassian looked at her. "You don't know what he's capable of," she said. "I know what he is. He doesn't operate the way you're expecting. He's not going to—" "Nyla." His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. The way a weight was quiet. The way something immovable was quiet. "Look at me." She looked at him. "He's been hunting you through this building for 18 hours, Cassian said, "while you were working, while you were sleeping." His eyes didn't move from hers. "That ends tonight." She held his gaze and felt something move through her that she couldn't immediately name. Not relief, not fear. Something older and more complicated. The specific, profound disorientation of standing behind someone rather than running in front of them. "Tonight," he said quietly, "your fear ends." Damon was already gone from the doorway. Nyla turned back to the monitors. The screens showed confirmation codes and secured documentation and the forensic architecture of Brandon's dismantled scheme. $3 million recovered, her name protected. And somewhere 2 floors below, the sound of footsteps moving upward. She sat very still, and she did not run. And the elevator, somewhere in the building's steel bones, began to move. The elevator moved. Nyla could hear it, or thought she could, the soft mechanical hum traveling through the building's bones like a current. And she wasn't sure anymore whether the sound was real or whether she was manufacturing it from the inside of a body that had been running on adrenaline and 2 hours of sleep, and the specific wired alertness of someone who had spent 18 months learning to hear footsteps in ordinary sounds. She kept her eyes on the monitors. The confirmation codes were still there, green text on dark background, clean and final and done. The money was back in Cassian's accounts. The documentation was sealed. The forensic chain linking Brandon's credential theft to the shell network was formatted and secured and ready for use in any proceeding that required it. She had done the work. The work was finished. She had nothing to do now except sit in this chair and wait for the elevator to arrive. And that was somehow the hardest thing she'd been asked to do in the last 18 hours. Cassian stood near the window. He wasn't watching the door. He was watching her. And she knew it the way she'd learned to know when she was being watched. Through the skin on the back of her neck, through some calibration in her peripheral vision that had been tuned very fine by 18 months of a relationship that had required constant environmental awareness just to feel safe inside her own home. The difference was that Cassian's attention didn't produce fear. She hadn't worked out what it produced yet. She was setting that question aside for a time when she had more available bandwidth. "You should step back from the door," Cassian said. "I'm not near the door. When they bring him in, step to the back of the room." She turned to look at him. "I'm not going to hide behind you." "I'm not asking you to hide." His voice was level. "I'm asking you to give me room to work." She held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the monitors. "Fine." The door opened. Not the main door. The service entry to the left of the kitchen, which she hadn't known was there until Damon came through it with 2 other men and Brandon Voss between them. Her first thought, absurdly, was that he looked smaller. She knew that wasn't true in any physical sense. Brandon was still 6 feet and broad through the shoulders and built with the dense, compact physicality of someone who'd spent years in gyms for reasons that had always been more about dominance than health. He was still wearing the gray suit from the gala, rumpled now, the jacket pulled awkwardly at one shoulder where someone had clearly grabbed it. His hair was less perfect than it had been in the ballroom. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before. Recent, barely beaded with blood. But he looked smaller. She understood, sitting very still in her chair with her hands flat on the table, that this was what happened when a person was removed from the context that had made them frightening. Brandon had been terrifying in her apartment, in corridors, in the specific geography of a life he'd learned to move through like a man who owned the floor plan. Here, pulled into a room where he was not the most dangerous presence by a significant margin, he looked like what he actually was. A man who had made a very serious miscalculation. His eyes found her immediately. Nyla. Her name in his mouth still did something to her stomach. Not fear exactly, but the muscle memory of fear, the way a healed injury aches in cold weather. "What did you do?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation delivered as a statement, and it carried the specific entitlement of someone who had spent years operating from the assumption that her choices were subject to his review. She said nothing. Cassian stepped forward from the window. He moved the way he always moved, unhurried, deliberate, taking up exactly the amount of space he wanted without advertisement. And when Brandon's eyes shifted to him, she watched something cross Brandon's face that she'd never seen there before. Genuine uncertainty. "Cassian Volkov," Brandon said. His voice was controlled. She recognized the effort it took. She'd watched him perform that control across a dinner table while his hand found her knee under the tablecloth and pressed down hard enough to leave a bruise. "I don't know what she's told you, but—" "Sit down," Cassian said. Not loudly. Not with any particular force of volume. With the specific, absolute authority of someone who had never needed volume to be obeyed. Brandon sat. Damon and the other 2 men arranged themselves in the room with the practiced geometry of people who knew exactly where to stand. Not close enough to be aggressive. Close enough to be architectural. Exits covered. Distance maintained. The room reorganized itself around Cassian without any visible instruction. Cassian pulled a chair from the table and sat across from Brandon. Leaned back, elbows on the arms of the chair, hands loose in his lap. Relaxed in the way of someone who was never not ready. "You stole $3 million from my operation," Cassian said. Brandon's jaw worked. "That's a significant accusation." "It's a documented fact." Cassian tilted his head slightly. "The documentation was completed approximately 40 minutes ago." He paused. "By her." Brandon looked at Nyla. The shift in his face was fast and then controlled, and in the half-second before the control came down, she saw it clearly. Not rage, not quite, but something adjacent to rage that was colder and more deliberate. The look of a man recalculating in real time. "You have no idea what you've done," he said to her. "I know exactly what I've done," she said. Her voice surprised her. It was steadier than she felt. You've attached yourself to a criminal organization. You've helped him recover money from a legitimate financial... Stop. The word came out flat and final, and she hadn't planned it, but she wasn't taking it back. Don't do that. Don't stand there and perform the injured party. She looked at him directly. She made herself hold the eye contact she'd spent 2 years learning to avoid. You used my credentials. You built a theft scheme and you ran it through my professional identity, and then you spent 6 months making sure I was too afraid to look closely at anything, because if I looked closely, you were never supposed to be involved. I am involved. You involved me. Her hands were flat on the table and she could feel them wanting to shake, and she kept them still. You involved me 14 months ago when you sat at my desk in my apartment and used my access to start building that network. You involved me every time you showed up somewhere I was supposed to be safe. You involved me tonight in that hallway. I was trying to protect you. His voice shifted, softened. She knew that register. It had worked on her for a long time. Nyla, I was trying to get to you before this happened, before you ended up in a room with someone who would... Enough, Cassian said. The word was quiet. It landed like a door closing. Brandon went still. Cassian looked at him for a moment with the same expression he'd worn since Brandon entered the room. Not angry, not contemptuous, simply and completely unimpressed, the way a person looked at a problem they'd already solved. The money is recovered, Cassian said. The forensic record has been corrected. The credential trail now documents the access as unauthorized. He paused. What happens next depends entirely on the next 3 minutes of this conversation. Brandon was quiet. She watched him thinking, actually watched the calculation moving behind his eyes, the same calculation she'd seen him run in a dozen different rooms when the situation had shifted on him. He was good at it. She had to give him that. He was very good at finding the available angle. You want something, Brandon said. I want to understand the full scope of what you took. Cassian's voice was even. The $3 million was not the only money that moved through that network. There are 2 additional accounts I have not yet recovered. Something moved through Nyla's chest. She looked at Cassian. He didn't look at her. She understood then that she hadn't been told everything, which shouldn't have surprised her. She was a tool he'd needed for a specific task, and tools were given the information required for the task, not the full picture. She understood how that worked. She'd spent her career in rooms where information was rationed. It still landed somewhere in her chest with a specific, unwelcome weight. I don't know what you're talking about, Brandon said. You moved the initial $3 million in October. The additional transfers occurred in November and January. Different network structures, same credential architecture. Cassian watched him. Same person. The January transfer was $700,000. Cassian's voice didn't change. The November transfer was $1.2 million. Total exposure is just under $5 million. He let that sit for a moment. Where's the rest of it? Brandon's mouth closed. His jaw was tight. She could see him making the decision in real time. The decision of how much to give and what to hold back, because men like Brandon always held something back, always maintained the reserve they believed would save them. I need something in return, Brandon said. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm the only person in this room who knows where the remaining accounts are. Brandon's voice steadied. He'd found his angle. He had something they needed, and he knew it. That gives me a position. Cassian looked at him for a long time. Damon, he said. Damon stepped forward and placed a laptop on the table in front of Brandon, open to a document. Brandon looked down at it, and something in his posture changed. Something subtle, but real. A tightening around the shoulders that she'd only seen on him once before, in a conversation about his finances that he'd ended abruptly and never returned to. Those are the accounts, Cassian said. Your name is on 2 of them. An address in the Cayman Islands that I believe you used as a mail address is on the 3rd. He paused. A federal investigation into the shell network that hosted your credential theft is currently active. The investigators do not yet have the account documentation I just showed you. He tilted his head. They will, in approximately 16 hours, unless I choose otherwise. Brandon was very still. Where's the money? Cassian said. The silence stretched. Nyla counted her own heartbeats without meaning to. An old habit from the worst nights of the relationship. The nights when the silence had meant something was about to change, and not for the better. Zurich, Brandon said finally. Different institution than the Geneva account. I used a secondary trust structure. His eyes went to Nyla. One she didn't build the map for. Cassian looked at her then. She was already pulling the secondary monitor toward her. Give me the structure, she said to Brandon. Her voice was flat and professional, and she did not look up from the screen. I'm not just going to... You're going to give me the structure, she said, or you're going to sit in this room and watch me find it without your help, which will take longer and leave a significantly less clean forensic trail on your end. She pulled up the network architecture she'd been working with. Your choice, but make it in the next 30 seconds because I'm starting either way. The silence was different this time. Brandon gave her the structure. She worked for 40 minutes. The room was quiet except for keyboard sounds and the occasional low exchange between Cassian and Damon near the window. Brandon sat at the table and said nothing. She was aware of him in her peripheral vision the way she was always aware of him. The specific, exhausting vigilance of a nervous system that had been trained by repetition to treat his presence as a threat condition. She worked through it the way she'd worked through everything in the last 18 hours. She set it aside and she did the work. The Zurich structure was more complex than the Geneva account. It had a secondary encryption layer she hadn't seen in the first network, newer, which told her he'd had help after October, or had done research, or both. She dismantled it in the methodical way she'd dismantled everything else. Layer by layer. Patience over speed. She found the account. Got it, she said. Cassian crossed the room and stood behind her chair. She could feel his presence behind her. Not threatening, but solid. The way a wall was solid. She showed him the screen. That's all of it, he said. Both remaining accounts, 1.9 million combined. She pointed to a specific string of characters on the left monitor. This credential lock is the last barrier. It's keyed to a personal identifier, a password or a code he set manually. Cassian looked at Brandon. Brandon looked at the table. The code, Cassian said. And then what? Brandon said. You take the money, and then what happens to me? The federal investigation receives your name. The documentation I hold determines whether you're the subject of a financial crime inquiry or a witness to one. Cassian's voice was measured. Cooperation changes the framing significantly. That's not a guarantee. No, Cassian agreed. It isn't. Brandon laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. Not humor, just the specific sound a person made when they'd run out of other options. You know what the problem is with people like you, he said. He was looking at Nyla. You always think the system will protect you. If you just do the right thing. If you just tell the truth. He shook his head. The system doesn't care. I've been working that system for 4 years, and I promise you, the system does not care. The code, Cassian said again. Brandon looked at him. Something settled in his face. A kind of resignation that she recognized as genuine because she'd seen performed resignation from him many times, and it had never looked like this. He gave the code. She ran it. The lock released. The accounts opened. She sat back in the chair and looked at the screen and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not relief, not triumph, something more complicated, something with exhaustion in it, and anger, and a question she hadn't let herself ask until just then. The federal inquiry, she said to Cassian. The timeline you gave me, 11 days. Yes. Was that accurate? A pause. Brief but present. The inquiry has been active for approximately 6 weeks, Cassian said. The 11-day figure represented the window before your name would have appeared prominently in their working documents. She turned in the chair to look at him. And you knew about the inquiry before tonight? Yes. Before the gala? Yes. She looked at him steadily. You knew who I was before I stepped into that elevator. Another pause, slightly longer. I knew who you were, he said. I didn't know you'd be at the gala. That was... He stopped. Convenient, she said. Coincidental. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said. They aren't. The room was very quiet. Damon had gone still near the window. The other 2 men were looking at various points on the walls with the focused neutrality of professionals pretending not to hear a conversation. Brandon, she noticed, was watching this exchange with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something close to fascination. She stood up from the chair. Her legs were stiff. 18 hours of sitting with occasional standing, and somewhere in the last hour, the adrenaline had begun to metabolize, and what was left underneath it was pure leaden exhaustion. "I need to know what I am in this room," she said to Cassian. "Right now, not an hour from now." She held his gaze. "Am I here because you needed a tool, and I happen to be the most available one? Or is there something else I'm not seeing?" Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Before he could answer, Damon moved. Fast. Faster than she'd expected from the controlled, minimal way he'd been operating all night. He crossed the room in 3 strides and put himself between Brandon and the table, and she turned and saw why. Brandon was on his feet. He'd moved during the conversation, during the moment when everyone's attention had been pulled toward the exchange between her and Cassian, and he'd gotten his hands on something from the table. Not a weapon. A phone. One of the burner units Cassian's team used for internal communication left on the table's edge when Damon had set down the laptop. He had it in his hand and he was already talking into it. "Penthouse level, East Tower, I need—" Damon had him by the wrist before the sentence completed. The phone hit the floor. Brandon's arm went up and behind him in a hold that looked simple and was clearly excruciating based on the sound Brandon made. "Who are you calling?" Cassian said. Brandon's face was pressed sideways, jaw tight with pain. He said nothing. "He called out before I got there," Damon said. His voice was flat. 3, maybe 4 seconds of open line. Cassian stood very still. Nyla looked at him. She watched something move through his face. Not fear, because she was becoming increasingly certain that Cassian Volkov did not experience fear the way ordinary people did, but something adjacent to it. A rapid, invisible reassessment. "Who did you call?" Cassian said again. Quiet. Very quiet. Brandon turned his head as far as the hold allowed and looked at Cassian. "Someone who doesn't like you," he said. "Someone who's been looking for a reason to know where you are." The room changed. She felt it. The specific atmospheric shift of a situation crossing a threshold from contained to open-ended. Cassian looked at Damon and something passed between them without words, and Damon was already on his own phone, moving toward the service entrance, speaking in short, clipped sentences. Cassian turned to her. "We need to move," he said. "Move where?" "Out of this building." He was already in motion, crossing to the secondary room, pulling something from a drawer, moving with the controlled efficiency of a person executing a plan they'd already made for a contingency they'd hoped not to use. "Now, there's a car in the basement level." "What did he just do?" she said. "Who did he call?" Cassian paused at the doorway, looked at her. "Someone who wants what you just recovered," he said, "and won't ask nicely for it." She stood in the middle of the penthouse, the confirmation code still glowing on the monitors, the rain still on the glass, the Manhattan skyline still enormous and indifferent behind it. And she understood that the work she'd spent the last 18 hours completing, the clean and finished thing she'd believed was done, had just become the beginning of something else entirely. She grabbed the secondary drive from the workstation. Instinct, pure professional instinct, the same reflex that made her back up documentation before anything else, and followed Cassian through the service entrance before she'd consciously decided to move. The corridor beyond was narrow and utilitarian, identical to the one she'd run through the night before, except that now she was moving through it beside Cassian instead of away from Brandon, and the distinction felt important in a way she didn't have time to examine. Damon was ahead of them. The other 2 men had stayed with Brandon, which she noted and filed without comment. "The drive," Cassian said, not looking at her, moving fast. "I have it." "Everything on it?" "Both recoveries. All documentation." "Yes." He nodded once. They reached a stairwell door and he pushed through it without breaking stride. "Who did he call?" she said again. They were moving down, fast. Her bare feet, she still had no shoes, hadn't had shoes since the night before, hit the cold metal stairs with a sound that seemed too loud in the enclosed space. "His name is Gregor Sabo," Cassian said. "He runs a competing operation out of the Northeast. We've had a contested border for 3 years. He paused at a landing, listened, continued down. He's been looking for leverage against me for most of that time. And the money I just recovered is leverage." His voice was flat. 5 million recovered through my network, documented in my name, With a federal inquiry already active on the shell structure, in the right hands, that documentation doesn't clear you. It buries both of us. She stopped on the landing. He was 2 steps below her, and he turned when she stopped, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't read in the dim stairwell light. "The documentation I built," she said carefully. "The forensic record showing the credential theft, the recovery protocol." She held the drive up slightly. "In the wrong framing, that doesn't show Brandon stealing from you. It shows me helping you move stolen money through a network I personally dismantled and rebuilt." Cassian said nothing. "That's what Sabo would do with it." "Yes," Cassian said. "So I came here last night to protect myself," she said. "And the work I did to protect myself is now the thing that we need to keep moving. Answer me." He looked at her. In the stairwell's gray light, his face was stripped of the penthouse's careful atmosphere, and what she saw was not comfortable. Not the controlled, deliberate man who'd brought her coffee and read documents and given her space to work without crowding her. This was something rawer. A person running their own calculation at speed, weighing variables she couldn't fully see. "The documentation can be reframed," he said. "If Sabo gets it before I can establish the counter record, yes, your exposure increases significantly." He paused. That was not the intended outcome. But it was a possible one. Yes. "Did you know that when you made the deal?" "A beat. Just long enough." "I assessed it as unlikely," he said. She laughed. It came out short and without any humor in it. "Unlikely." She looked at the drive in her hand. "I spent 11 years building a reputation that I leveraged every single day to do my job. Every case I've ever worked, every firm that ever hired me. All of it runs on the fact that my name on a document means something specific." She kept her voice even. She was very focused on keeping her voice even. "And you assessed the risk to that as unlikely." "Nyla, don't!" She started moving again, down the stairs, past him. "Just get us out of the building." He let her pass. Fell into step behind her, which she found she couldn't entirely analyze, whether it was deference or tactical, whether he was covering the rear or simply giving her the things she'd just asked for in the only way available. She moved down the stairs and did not think about it. The basement level smelled of concrete and exhaust, and the particular industrial cold of underground parking. Damon was already there, beside a black vehicle with the engine running. 2 other men she hadn't seen before stood at the periphery with the same architectural stillness as Cassian's people always seemed to manage. She got in. Cassian got in beside her. Damon drove. They moved through the basement exit and into the city's early morning, pale light, wet streets, the city running its weekend rhythms with complete indifference to what had just happened in a penthouse 40 floors above street level. She held the drive in both hands and looked out the window and said nothing for 4 blocks. "Where are we going?" she said. "Safe house. Brooklyn. And then we deal with Sabo." "How?" Cassian was quiet for a moment. "He'll want a meeting. That's how he operates. He'll make contact, establish what he has, and propose terms." His voice was measured. "He's not reckless. He won't move against me directly without leverage he can use publicly. The documentation is his leverage, which he doesn't have yet." Brandon connected the call for 3 or 4 seconds before Damon cut it. He communicated location, not content. He looked at her. "Sabo knows where we were. He doesn't yet know what we have or what we did. So there's a window. A short one." She turned the drive over in her hands. Thought about the forensic structure she'd built over the last 18 hours, the layers of it, the documentation chains, the specific way she'd formatted the credential evidence and the recovery records. "The documentation can be restructured," she said slowly. Cassian looked at her. "Not falsified," she said immediately, because she saw what he thought she meant. "I don't falsify records. I never have." She paused. "But forensic documentation is a presentation of facts, and the way facts are presented determines what story they tell. The architecture I built shows the credential theft and the recovery. If I add a second layer, a parallel record of the federal inquiry timeline and Sabo's known financial history." She stopped. Thought. "If Sabo is what you say he is, he has his own exposure points. His own network contacts he'd prefer weren't documented." "He does," Cassian said carefully. "Then the counter record isn't just a defense. It's a frame that makes using my documentation against you the most expensive possible option for him." She looked at Cassian directly. You go into that meeting with something that hurts him as much as what he thinks he has on you. Then it's not leverage, it's a standoff. Cassian held her gaze for a moment. That's a significant amount of additional work, he said. I'm aware. She looked back out the window. I'm also aware that at this point my name is in this deep enough that half measures are not going to be sufficient. The car moved across the bridge. The East River was gray and flat below them, the morning light doing nothing to improve it. What? The safe house was a brownstone in Carroll Gardens that looked from the outside like every other brownstone on the block, maintained, unremarkable, the kind of building that existed to be not noticed. Inside it was 3 floors of operational space dressed as a residence, the way all such places were dressed. Functional kitchen. Multiple exits. A room on the 2nd floor with equipment she recognized and equipment she didn't. Damon gave her shoes. Women's shoes. Flat and plain and exactly her size, which raised a question she chose not to ask out loud. She set up at the 2nd floor workstation and started building. Cassian worked the phones in the adjacent room. She could hear him through the wall. Not the words, just the cadence. The low measured rhythm of a person managing multiple situations simultaneously with the kind of practice containment that only came from having done it many times before. Occasionally she heard a different register, something sharper, and she registered it the way she registered all information. Filed, noted, not yet interpreted. She worked for 3 hours. The counter documentation took shape under her hands with the methodical precision she'd spent a career developing. She pulled Sabo's network contacts from 3 separate financial databases she had legitimate access credentials for. Her professional credentials, untouched, still clean, whatever else had happened. She cross-referenced them against the shell structure documentation from the penthouse, identifying 4 overlap points where Sabo's financial history intersected with the network Brandon had used. 2 of those intersections were significant. She sat back and looked at what she'd found and felt the specific cold alertness that came when a forensic picture showed you something larger than you'd been looking for. She went to the door. Cassian. He appeared from the adjacent room 30 seconds later, phone still in his hand. The controlled composure was intact, but there was something working underneath it now, a tightness around the jaw that hadn't been there in the penthouse. Look at this, she said. He crossed to the workstation, stood behind her chair. She watched his reflection in the dark margin of the screen as he read. He went still. Sabo's network didn't intersect with Brandon's structure by accident, she said. These 4 contact points, look at the dates. October, November, January. She pointed to the screen. Same months as the 3 transfers from your accounts. Cassian said nothing. Brandon didn't build that shell network alone, she said. Someone helped him design the secondary encryption layer I found in Zurich. Someone who knew your financial architecture well enough to understand what would and wouldn't trip your internal monitoring. She looked up at his reflection. Sabo didn't just find out about the theft from Brandon's phone call tonight. He knew about it because he helped engineer it. The room was very quiet. Brandon was working with him, Cassian said. His voice was controlled in a way that took visible effort. From the beginning, possibly before October, I'd need more time to trace the earlier contacts. She turned in the chair to face him. The call Brandon made tonight wasn't a panic move. It was a check-in. They had a protocol. If Brandon got caught, Sabo would collect the documentation and use it. She paused. Brandon was never the architect of this. He was the access point. Sabo was the architect. Cassian stood very still. She'd seen him absorb difficult information before, had watched him process the confirmation of the Geneva account, the discovery of the additional Zurich funds, the news of Brandon's call. Each time he'd gone still and then reorganized and moved. This was different. This stillness had a different quality, something older in it. How long have you and Sabo had the contested border? She said quietly. 3 years, he said, and in 3 years, he never made a direct move. No, because he was building this instead. She looked at the screen. He was building something that didn't require a direct move, something that would dismantle you from the inside out, with a federal investigation to finish the work. She paused. If tonight had gone the way they planned it, if Brandon had gotten to me before I reached the elevator, or if I'd never ended up in your penthouse, the documentation trail would have sat dormant until the federal inquiry got close enough, And then Sabo would have handed them your name attached to $5 million in a shell network and a forensic record that looked like your operation built the whole thing. Cassian turned away from the screen. He walked to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out at the Brooklyn street below. His shoulders were level. His hands were at his sides. Everything about his posture was controlled. She gave him a moment. "The meeting with Sabo," she said. "He'll still want it." "Yes." "The counter-documentation I'm building. It shows his involvement in the original theft. If I finish it and you walk into that meeting with it, he'll know we found it." Cassian turned from the window. His face had reset. Whatever she'd seen moving underneath it was gone. Which changes the dynamic of the meeting significantly. It changes it in your favor. It changes it in an unpredictable direction. He crossed back to the workstation, looked at the screen. Sabo is careful. If he understands that his involvement is documented, he doesn't negotiate, he escalates. Then we don't let him understand it until the moment it's too late for escalation to be useful. She looked up at him. "That's what the meeting is for. You go in appearing to negotiate from a defensive position. He thinks he has the advantage, and then..." Her phone buzzed. She didn't have her phone. She'd left it in the ballroom the night before. But the workstation's secondary notification panel lit up, one of Cassian's communication systems, which Damon had logged her access credentials into that morning for work purposes. She looked at the notification. Her stomach turned over slowly and completely. The message was routed through her professional forensic network, her firm's internal communication system, the one only colleagues and authorized legal contacts could access. It had her name on it, her actual name with her professional title, in a header that used her firm's official formatting. It was from the federal inquiry, not a subpoena. Not yet. A formal notification of interest, the specific, careful language investigators used when they wanted someone to understand they were being watched without yet committing to a direction. Her name, her credentials, the shell network, a date for a voluntary interview in 5 days. 5 days. Not 11. She stared at the screen. "They accelerated," she said. Her voice came out strange, flat in a way that didn't match what was happening in her chest. Cassian leaned over her shoulder and read the notification. She felt him go still again, the same quality of stillness as before, but faster this time, more complete. "This came through your professional network," he said. "Yes." Which means someone gave them my credentials as a priority contact." She turned to look at him, and she was very close to him in the small space between the chair and his presence behind her, and his face was right there, and it would have been easy to look away, but she didn't. "Someone gave them my name and my professional access information as a direct line into the investigation." She paused. "Before tonight, before Brandon's call, before any of this." She watched his face. "How long has my name been in this inquiry, Cassian?" The silence was 4 seconds long. She counted them. "Longer than 11 days, he said. She stood up. The chair rolled back and hit the desk behind her, and she was on her feet, and there were approximately 18 inches between her and him, and she held every one of them. "How long?" she said. 6 weeks. His voice was level. "Your name appeared in the preliminary document 6 weeks ago. As a person of interest, not a subject. The timeline I gave you was a controlled amount of information." Her voice was very quiet now. Quiet in a way that had nothing to do with calm. "You told me 11 days because 11 days was enough to make me say yes, but not enough to make me ask certain questions. I told you 11 days because that was the window before your status elevated from person of interest to active subject." His eyes didn't move from hers. That part was accurate. But the rest of it? She stepped back, 1 step, put more of the 18 inches to use. The rest of the framing, the elevator, the deal, She stopped herself, breathed. "Did you arrange to be at the gala?" "No." "But you knew who I was?" "Yes." "You'd been watching me for 6 weeks." "I'd been watching the inquiry for 6 weeks." "You were part of the inquiry." "That's a very precise distinction." "It's an accurate one." She looked at him. She looked at the notification on the screen. She looked at the drive she'd set on the desk beside the workstation, which contained every piece of documentation she'd built over the last 20 hours. Documentation that was currently the only thing standing between her name and an active federal investigation that had been building around her for 6 weeks without her knowledge. While she'd been changing her locks and her routes and her gym and believing the thing she was afraid of was one man with an obsession. The thing she'd been afraid of had never been Brandon. Brandon had been a symptom. The actual disease had been building in server rooms and federal offices and the operational calculations of two men running competing criminal empires, and she had been a piece on a board she hadn't known she was standing on. She picked up the drive. "I'm going to finish the counter documentation," she said. Her voice was back under control. It cost her. "Not for you. Not for the deal we made. For me. Because in 5 days I have to walk into a federal interview, and the only thing in that room that protects my name is what's on this drive." Cassian said nothing. "And when it's finished," she said, "you're going to tell me everything. Not the operational version. Not the managed version. Everything you know about how my name ended up in that inquiry and what you've been doing about it for 6 weeks. She held his gaze. "If I find out there's another layer you've been managing, another convenient timeline, another assessed as unlikely risk, I walk out of this building and I go directly to the inquiry and I give them everything I have, including you." The room was very quiet. "Agreed," Cassian said. She sat back down, opened the workstation, pulled up the documentation architecture. Her hands were steady. That was the only thing she was certain of in that moment. That her hands were steady, and the drive was in her hand, and the work was not finished, and she was going to finish it. She worked through the morning without stopping. Cassian stayed out of the room. She didn't know if that was respect or strategy, and she didn't spend energy deciding. She pulled every accessible database thread she had legitimate credentials for, cross-referenced Szebo's financial footprint against the Shell network documentation with the focused precision of someone who understood that the work in front of her was not professional anymore. It had stopped being professional somewhere around the moment she'd seen her name on a federal notification routed through her firm's internal system. This was survival now. Dressed in the language of forensic accounting, executed with the tools of forensic accounting, but survival underneath all of it. She found 3 more intersection points between Szebo's network and Brandon's structure. One of them was clean enough to be coincidental. The other 2 were not. The second had a transaction signature she recognized from a money laundering case she'd consulted on 2 years ago. A specific layering technique that used charitable foundation structures as intermediary vehicles, rotating funds through grant disbursements that were technically legal and practically invisible. She'd written a paper on that technique. She'd presented it at a financial crimes conference in Chicago 18 months ago. She sat very still for a moment when she understood that. Then she went to the door. Cassian. He was in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, phone face down at his side. He looked like a man doing nothing, which she was learning meant he was doing several things simultaneously inside a very controlled exterior. "The layering technique in Szebo's network," she said. "The charitable foundation structure. Someone built that using methodology from a paper I published 18 months ago." Cassian looked at her. "Which means either Szebo's people read financial crimes literature, or someone gave it to them," he said. "Or someone gave it to them." She held his gaze. "Who in your organization has access to your financial monitoring architecture?" The question landed, and she watched him process it. Watched the very precise, very controlled way he worked through the implications without letting any of it reach his face. 4 people, he said. "How long have all 4 of them been with you?" 3 of them, over a decade. He paused. 1 of them, 14 months. She let the number sit between them. 14 months. The same window as the earliest credential access in Brandon's network. The same window as the beginning of everything. "I need to talk to the new one," she said. "That's not possible right now." "Why?" "Because he's currently managing the logistics for the Szebo meeting, and pulling him out of that role 20 minutes before the meeting is a signal neither of us can afford to send." Cassian's voice was flat. "If he's the leak, he can't know we've identified him until we're in a position to contain it. If he's not, we've burned a resource we need." She understood the logic. She didn't like it, but she understood it. "When is the meeting?" she said. 2 hours. He pushed off the wall. "Are you finished?" "Close." She looked at him. "I need you to understand what I've built. Not the summary. The actual structure. If something happens in that meeting and I'm not in the room, you're going to be in the room." She blinked. "What?" The documentation you've built is only useful in that meeting if the person presenting it understands its architecture well enough to counter any challenge Sabo's people make to its validity. He held her gaze. That's not me. That's you. She stood in the doorway and looked at him and thought about the specific layered insanity of what he was proposing. Bringing a forensic auditor with an active federal notification into a room with two competing criminal organization leaders to present financial counter-documentation in real time. You're not seriously... You said you wanted to understand your position in this, Cassian said. This is your position. The work you did isn't peripheral. It's the center of every play available to us in the next 2 hours. His eyes were steady. I'm not asking you to be in the room as protection or as a gesture. I'm asking because you're the most qualified person I have. She looked at him for a long time. Tell me everything about Sabo, she said. Right now. All of it. He told her. Cool. The meeting location was a restaurant in Red Hook that was closed on Sunday mornings and that Cassian apparently had some arrangement with, the nature of which she didn't ask about. They arrived 40 minutes early. Damon swept the space with 2 other men while Cassian walked the room once, slowly, the way she'd come to recognize as his version of orientation, cataloging exits, sightlines, the position of every surface that could be used for cover or leverage. She set up at a table near the back. Laptop, the drive. A printed summary she'd prepared in the last 20 minutes of the brownstone work session, organized in the precise, layered format she used for courtroom presentations. The kind of document that could be followed by someone who hadn't built it, that told its story in sequence without requiring explanation. Her hands were steady, her stomach was not. But that was internal, and she'd been managing internal conditions since she was 23 years old, and she knew how to keep them off her face. Sabo arrived 12 minutes early, which Cassian noted with a slight tension in his jaw that confirmed it was unexpected. Gregor Sabo was smaller than she'd imagined from the build-up. Compact, 50s, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance communicated power before words did. He came in with 2 men and a woman she clocked immediately as legal or financial. The way she held a leather portfolio, the way her eyes went to the table before they went to the people. He saw Cassian first. Then his eyes moved to Nyla, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, something more calculated than surprise. I didn't expect a guest, Sabo said. His accent was heavier than Cassian's, saw Eastern European bedrock with less American smoothing over it. Nyla Hartwell, Cassian said. She's been managing the financial documentation review. Sabo looked at her for a moment. I know who she is. I assumed, Cassian said. They sat. The woman with the portfolio sat beside Sabo. His 2 men stayed standing, which meant Damon and the other man stayed standing, and the room arranged itself into the specific tense geometry of a conversation where everyone was aware that the words were the least dangerous things present. You had an eventful night, Sabo said to Cassian. Productive, Cassian said. I heard about the hotel. Sabo placed his hands flat on the table, clean hands, manicured, the hands of a man who hadn't done physical work in a long time. I heard about Brandon Voss. I understand there was some financial recovery involved. There was. Then you understand why I wanted this conversation. Sabo leaned back slightly. You've recovered funds that move through a network that intersects with my interests. That creates a situation we should discuss cleanly. Your interests, Cassian said. My interests. Sabo held his gaze. The network Voss used, certain structural elements were developed with consultation I provided, which means certain elements of the documentation trail have my fingerprints on them. He paused. I'd like those elements addressed before they reach anyone else's attention. Nyla kept her face neutral. Sabo had just confirmed what she'd spent the morning documenting, with the specific boldness of a man who believed he was negotiating from strength and wanted to establish that quickly. That's a significant admission, Cassian said. It's a practical one. Sabo looked at Nyla. Ms. Hartwell, you built the recovery documentation. I did, she said. Then you've seen the network architecture. You know what I'm referring to. I know what you're referring to. Then you understand that the documentation, as currently structured, creates exposure for multiple parties, including yourself. He held her gaze with the practiced steadiness of a man who'd had difficult conversations in difficult rooms for a long time. The federal inquiry that was opened on the Shell network. Your name has been in that file for 6 weeks. I have a contact in the inquiry. I know exactly where your exposure sits." She looked at him. "So do I," she said. Something moved in his expression, a small recalibration. "Then we both understand the stakes," he said. "The documentation you've built can be structured in multiple ways. The way it's currently structured exposes my network contacts alongside Voss's credential theft. A restructured version, one that focuses narrowly on the credential theft and the recovery, resolves the inquiry around your name without creating additional complications." He paused. "I can ensure your federal exposure is resolved cleanly. Your name removed from the inquiry entirely, not just downgraded. In exchange, the documentation of my network contacts is excluded." The room was very quiet. She felt Cassian beside her, completely still, and she understood without looking at him that this was the moment, the fulcrum point the entire morning had been building toward, the place where the available moves narrowed to the ones that actually mattered. She picked up the printed summary from the table. "I want to show you something," she said to Sabo. She kept her voice conversational. She slid the document across the table. "Page 3. Sabo looked at it. His legal or financial woman leaned in beside him. "The 4 intersection points between your network and Brandon Voss's shell structure," Nyla said. "October, November, January, and a 4th contact point I identified this morning that you may not be aware I found." She kept her hands flat on the table. "The 4th one uses a charitable foundation layering technique, a specific rotation method through grant disbursements." She paused. "It's documented in a paper I published 18 months ago in the Journal of Financial Crimes Investigation, which means whoever designed that element of your network had access to specialized literature and the expertise to implement it." She looked at him. "That's a very traceable design signature." Sabo's face was still. His hands on the document had not moved. "The federal inquiry," she continued, "currently has my name as a person of interest based on credential access logs. What they don't have is the complete network architecture showing the origin of the shell structure design, the consultation trail between your organization and Voss, and the 3-year documented history of financial boundary disputes between your operation and Cassian's." She looked at him steadily. "If that documentation reaches the inquiry, and I want to be precise about this, it doesn't complicate your situation, it ends it." The silence in the room had a physical weight. Sabo looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Cassian, then back at her. "You brought an auditor to this meeting," he said to Cassian. There was something in his voice she couldn't entirely read, not quite admiration, not quite anger. "She brought herself," Cassian said. "The documentation you're describing," Szabo said to her, "does it currently exist in a form accessible to the inquiry?" "Not yet," she said. "It exists on a drive and in a printout currently in this room, and you're willing to hold it. I'm willing to structure it in a way that protects my name and accurately represents the credential theft without creating unnecessary additional exposure." She held his gaze. "In exchange for your contact in the federal inquiry, ensuring my name is removed entirely from the active subject list, not downgraded, removed, and Cassian's accounts. The recovery is already complete. The money is already back." She kept her voice even. "What Cassian does with his own accounts is not my area." Szabo was quiet. She could see him running the calculation, the same kind of calculation she ran when she was dismantling a financial structure, looking for the load-bearing elements, understanding what moved when you moved something else. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something crossed his face, fast, controlled, almost invisible. Almost. She'd spent 11 years reading micro-expressions across negotiating tables and deposition rooms. She saw it. "Excuse me," Szabo said. He stood, stepped away from the table, and spoke briefly into the phone in a language she didn't know. 30 seconds. He came back and sat down and his face was reset. But the woman beside him had shifted her posture, slightly. The portfolio in her hands had moved from relaxed to held. Nyla looked at Cassian. He'd seen it too. "There's a development you should be aware of," Szabo said. His voice had changed, not dramatically. "Enough. Brandon Voss is no longer in the custody of your people." The room temperature dropped. "What?" Cassian said. "He was moved from the hotel approximately 90 minutes ago." Szabo's eyes were steady. "By people who were not yours." Cassian's jaw tightened. by yours. He reached out through a secondary contact before your man cut the call last night. Apparently 4 seconds was sufficient. Sabo looked at Nyla. He's currently in a location I control, which creates a new variable in this conversation. He paused. The federal inquiry contact I mentioned, my leverage on that relationship requires documentation of certain transactions that Voss can corroborate. He looked between them. Which means Voss has value beyond what you've already extracted from him. She felt the shape of what he was doing, felt it the way she felt a network structure when the pieces finally cohered, the sick clarity of understanding something you'd been working around for hours. Brandon wasn't the endgame. Brandon was never the endgame. Brandon was still a piece on the board. You're not here to negotiate documentation, she said. Sabo looked at her. You came here knowing you had him, she said. The meeting was never about the documentation. The meeting was about establishing what we have while you held a card we didn't know about. She looked at him. What do you want? Sabo was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face changed. A very small thing, almost like acknowledgement. The recovery documentation, he said, all of it. Every layer she built, including the parts that implicate my network, handed to me directly. He looked at Cassian. In exchange, Voss stays out of federal hands. My contact in the inquiry removes both your names from active consideration, and the border dispute between our operations is formalized with a boundary that resolves the contested territory in my favor. The silence stretched. If we say no, Cassian said, Voss goes to the inquiry within the hour, with documentation I've been building for 3 years that frames the entire Shell network as your operation. He paused. And Ms. Hartwell's credentials are the access trail they've been looking for. Nyla's heart was hitting the inside of her chest with a force and rhythm that had nothing to do with calm. She kept her breathing even. She kept her hands flat on the table. She looked at the printed summary in front of Sabo, and she thought about the drive in the laptop bag at her feet. And she thought about the federal notification on the workstation in Brooklyn, and she thought about 11 years of building something clean in an industry that rewarded exactly the opposite. And she thought about Brandon in a room somewhere she couldn't see, being managed like a financial instrument, which was exactly what he'd always treated her as. She thought about the elevator, the specific, irreversible moment of stepping inside it. She looked at Cassian. His eyes were on Sabo. His face was controlled in a way she now understood was not the absence of feeling, but the absolute, practiced containment of it. A man who had learned long ago that the moment emotion reached his face in a room like this was the moment the room became more dangerous. He looked at her. One look. Brief. Carrying a question he couldn't ask out loud. She looked back at him and felt the specific, terrifying clarity of a person who has run out of safe options and is therefore, finally, free to choose the dangerous one. She picked up the laptop, opened it, pulled up the full documentation architecture. Every layer, every chain, every intersection point, including the 4 she'd found on Sabo, displayed on the screen in the organized, precise, devastating format she'd spent the morning building. There's something you should understand about forensic documentation, she said to Sabo. Her voice was very steady. Once it's built, it doesn't live only in the place you can see it. Good documentation is distributed, redundant, built with contingency chains that activate on specific triggers. She turned the screen toward him. Everything on this drive has already been uploaded to 3 separate secure servers with time-locked release protocols. If those locks aren't manually reset within, she checked the time, 4 hours, everything uploads directly to the Federal Inquiry's secure submission portal, automatically, without any further action from me. Sabo looked at the screen. I built the locks this morning, she said, while you were traveling to this meeting. The room was very, very quiet. Sabo's legal or financial woman was no longer pretending to be neutral. She was reading the screen with the focused attention of someone doing rapid damage assessment. You're bluffing, Sabo said. I spent 11 years building documentation that holds up in federal court, she said. I don't bluff. I build. She held his gaze. You have 4 hours to return Brandon Voss, remove my name from the federal inquiry, and walk away from this table. After 4 hours, the question of what you'd like to negotiate becomes irrelevant because there's nothing left to negotiate. Sabo looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Cassian. Cassian looked back at him with the expression of a man who had placed a bet and was waiting for the cards to turn. Sabo looked at the screen for a long time. Not the panicked looking of a man caught off guard. The measured, unhurried looking of a man who understood he was being assessed and was doing his own assessing simultaneously. His hands were flat on the table. His breathing was controlled. The woman beside him had gone very still in the specific way of someone trained to read rooms, and who had just read this one and did not like what she'd found. The two men standing behind Sabo had shifted their weight. Nyla registered it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. Damon registered it too. She could tell by the way his right shoulder moved a quarter inch. 4 hours is a short window, Szabo said finally. It's the window I built, Nyla said. I didn't build it for your convenience. If you release that documentation, I don't release it. The protocol releases it, automatically, which is the point. She held his gaze. There's no negotiating with a timer, Mr. Szabo. There's only deciding before it runs out. Szabo looked at Cassian. You trust her. I trust the work, Cassian said. That's not what I asked. A pause. Brief. Yes, Cassian said. Szabo sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just briefly, the way a person looked when they were running final calculations and needed a second without anyone's face in their sightline. Then he looked back at the table. Voss will be returned, he said. Your name will be removed from the inquiry's active subject designation within 48 hours. My contact needs time to move cleanly. He looked at Nyla. 48 hours, not 4. The upload protocol needs to reflect that. 24, she said. 36. She looked at him, thought about the mechanics of it, what was actually achievable in the federal system in that window, what her contact would realistically need, whether the number was logistics or negotiating position. She'd spent 11 years in rooms where the difference between those two things determined outcomes. 36, she said, and I want written confirmation from your contact that the removal is processing before I adjust the upload timer, not after. Szabo looked at the woman beside him. Something passed between them without words. Agreed, he said. The territorial dispute, Cassian said. His voice was level. She'd almost forgotten that piece of it. The border dispute that had been the original engine of 3 years of careful, patient destruction aimed at Cassian's operation. The boundary resolution you proposed. My current terms are not terms I'll accept. Cassian leaned forward slightly. The contested territory stays unresolved, a formal non-aggression boundary documented and held by both parties, with no movement in either direction. You expand east of your current line, the documentation releases regardless of any other agreement. He paused. You stay where you are, we stay where we are, and this conversation ends the war without anyone winning it. Szabo was quiet. You spent 3 years building something to take what you wanted, Cassian said. It didn't work. That's the outcome. You walk away with your network intact, your name off federal records, and your organization operational. He looked at him steadily. That's not nothing. The restaurant was silent. Somewhere outside a car passed. The sound of the city doing its ordinary Sunday business, completely indifferent to the specific weight of the room. Agreed, Szabo said. He stood, straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of a man restoring his presentation. He looked at Nyla one more time, a look she couldn't entirely decode, somewhere between assessment and something that might have been, in another context, respect. You're in an interesting position, Ms. Hartwell, he said, working for a man like him. I'm not working for him, she said. Szabo considered that. Nodded once. Then he walked out, the woman with the portfolio and both standing men following in the clean practice sequence of people who'd done this exit before. The door closed. The room was very quiet. Nyla let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like the entire conversation. It came out slow and uneven, and she didn't try to control it because Szabo was gone, and she'd been controlling her breathing for 4 hours, and she was done. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't let them shake during the meeting. She let them shake now, briefly, holding them in her lap under the table where the tremor lasted 6 seconds and then stopped. Damon was already on his phone. The 2 other men were moving toward the door. The operational machinery of the situation re-engaging around her with the efficiency she'd come to recognize as Cassian's organizational signature. Things moved when they needed to move, without announcement, without visible direction. Cassian sat down across from her. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at her with the same steady, unhurried attention he'd turned on her since the elevator, and she was too exhausted to find it complicated. The upload protocol, he said. Was it real? She looked at him. Does it matter? Yes. Why? Because if it was real, I need to know the reset procedure. And if it wasn't, he said, I want to understand how you built a bluff that specific and sold it that cleanly. She looked at the laptop. It was real, she said. I built it this morning. 3 servers, time-locked, 36-hour window now. She paused. I'll give you the reset credentials when Brandon is returned and the federal confirmation comes through. Cassian held her gaze. Not before. Not before. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, the way it never quite was, but the territory adjacent to one. Good, he said. Brandon was returned 4 hours later, not to the restaurant, not to Cassian directly, to a location Damon coordinated through 2 intermediary contacts, a handoff that Nyla wasn't present for and was told about afterward in a brief, factual summary that communicated logistics rather than detail. She was back at the brownstone when it happened. She'd slept for 3 hours, real sleep, not the 2-hour survival sleep from the night before, but actual deep unconsciousness that came from a body finally spending the adrenaline it had been banking since a Manhattan corridor the night before. She woke up disoriented and sore and hungry in a way that felt almost normal, and she ate something from the brownstone kitchen that she couldn't have described afterward. And she was working at the second-floor station when Damon appeared in the doorway and said Voss is contained with the economy of a man who considered brevity a professional standard. Contained where, she said. Secure location, out of play. He paused. Mr. Volkov is downstairs. She saved her work. Closed the laptop. Went downstairs. Cassian was in the front room, standing at the window. Still the same clothes from the morning. Both of them had been in the same clothes since the gala, which felt, now that she noticed it, like a detail from someone else's life. He turned when she came in. It's done, he said. Zabo's contact. Made contact with my legal team 20 minutes ago. The removal process is initiated. He held out his phone, a message on screen, a number she didn't recognize, 3 lines of text that communicated the essential fact without ceremony. Her name, the inquiry, status change processing. She read it twice. Then she handed the phone back. She sat down on the edge of the couch, and she looked at her hands, and she let herself understand, slowly and fully, that it was over. The version of it she could control anyway. The documentation was built. The deal was closed. The clock was running on the federal process, and the pieces were in motion, and there was nothing left that required her immediate action. For the first time in 36 hours, she had nothing her hands needed to do. Tell me about the 14-month employee, she said. Cassian sat down in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth to give and landing on all of it. His name is Marcus Reeve. He came to me with strong credentials and a referral from someone I trusted. He paused. The referral, I've since established, was manufactured. Reeve was placed in my organization by Sabo 14 months ago. He looked at her. He had access to my financial monitoring architecture. He had access to my operational schedules and communication patterns. He paused again. He had access to the information that made it possible to build a shell network that moved through my systems without triggering internal alerts. Where is he now? In a conversation he won't enjoy. His voice was flat. Not cruel, just factual, in the way of a man reporting a process rather than a feeling. She nodded. She didn't ask for more detail than that because she understood the outline, and the outline was sufficient. He knew about me, she said. Reeve. He's the one who identified me as the weak point. Yes. Cassian held her gaze. Your paper on the charitable foundation layering technique, your professional credentials, your relationship with Voss, which Sabo's people identified when Voss first approached them about the theft scheme. He paused. You were selected because your expertise made the documentation convincing, and your proximity to Voss made your credentials accessible. And because I was isolated, she said, not bitterly, just accurately. Yes, she'd spent 2 years inside a relationship that had systematically reduced her available support, subtle movements, each one individually explicable, collectively producing a person who'd changed her apartment and her routes and her gym, and had no one she could call when she ended up in an empty elevator corridor with no shoes. She'd known that. She'd done the work to understand it. She'd sat across from a therapist for 8 months and mapped the architecture of it with the same methodical patience she brought to financial networks. Understanding it hadn't made it not true. "I need you to answer the question I asked you this morning," she said. "In the stairwell." Cassian looked at her. "You'd been watching the inquiry for 6 weeks. You knew who I was. You knew about the credential theft and the shell network and the federal timeline." She held his gaze steadily. "When I stepped into that elevator, when I was standing there with no shoes and no phone and nowhere to go, were you going to find me regardless of whether I happened to step into your elevator, or was it genuinely coincidence?" The room was quiet. "I had identified you as the person most capable of dismantling the network," Cassian said. "I had a plan to make contact through professional channels, a firm introduction, a consultation request." He paused. "Legitimate. Nothing like this. But the gala was on my calendar as an obligation. It was not on my calendar as an opportunity." He held her gaze. "I didn't know you'd be there. I didn't arrange it. When you came through those doors..." He stopped. "It was coincidence. The first time in 3 years that something in this situation moved in my favor by accident rather than by work." She looked at him. She was a person who read documents for a living, who understood that the most important information in any document was what the author chose to include and what they chose to leave out, who had spent 11 years learning to hear the thing being managed in every careful phrasing. She believed him. She didn't entirely understand why that mattered as much as it did, but it did. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay, don't make it more than it is," she said. "I'm just saying I believe you." "I know what you're saying." She stood up, went to the window. The Brooklyn street outside was doing its late afternoon Sunday thing. A woman walking a dog, a man carrying groceries, the ordinary texture of a city that had no awareness of and no interest in what had happened inside this building, and a penthouse 40 stories up in Manhattan in the last 36 hours. "What happens now?" she said. Not to him exactly, to the window, to the general question. "The federal process runs its course. Your name comes off the active list. The documentation I hold ensures it stays off." Cassian's voice came from behind her, from the chair. He hadn't moved. "The Shell Network records are sealed in my legal archive. If anything develops that requires them, they're available." "Brandon?" A pause. "He won't be a problem." She turned from the window. "That's not what I asked." Cassian looked at her. "He's alive. He'll stay alive." He paused. "He won't be in a position to access financial systems, use professional credentials, or contact anyone he used to know." He held her gaze. "The federal inquiry will receive documentation of his credential theft. Not the full network picture. Enough to make him a subject rather than a witness. He'll spend the next several years in legal proceedings." He paused. "Losing." She thought about the ballroom, the gray suit, the patient, deliberate walk of a man who had spent 14 months building a trap around her professional identity while sitting at her desk using her coffee mug and telling her she was the most important person in his life. "That's enough," she said. She meant it. She examined it as she said it to make sure she meant it, the way she examined everything, methodically, without mercy. And it was true. She didn't want him destroyed. She wanted him to stop. She wanted his capacity to move through the world at her expense removed permanently, and what Cassian was describing accomplished that. "The 36-hour timer," she said, "I need to reset it when the federal confirmation comes through." "When the confirmation comes through?" She looked at him. "And then I need to go home." Something moved in his face. "Home," he said. "My apartment. The Upper West Side." She paused. "I left my handbag on a table at the Aldrich Grand. My phone is in it. My ID. My keys." She looked at him. "I'd like my keys back." "I can have someone. I'd like to get them myself." She paused. "I need to go back there. I need to walk back into that building and pick up my bag and leave through the front door." She held his gaze. Because if I don't do that, the ballroom stays the thing that happened to me instead of the thing I walked out of. Cassian was quiet for a moment. I'll have a car take you, he said. I'll take the subway. Nyla? I'll take the subway, she said again. Evenly, firmly, without anger. The situation is resolved. The documentation is locked. Sabo has no reason to move against me, and Brandon is contained. She looked at him. I'm a forensic auditor from the Upper West Side. I take the subway. He held her gaze for a long moment. The G train to Smith Ninth, he said. Then the F uptown. I know how to get home, she said. But something in her chest did a complicated thing when he said it, because he knew the subway route from Carroll Gardens to the Upper West Side, which meant he'd looked at more than her professional credentials in 6 weeks. And she filed that information carefully and did not decide what to do with it yet. The Aldrich Grand looked the same. Of course it looked the same. It was a hotel. Hotels were specifically designed to look the same regardless of what had happened inside them, which was either comforting or bleak depending on your relationship to continuity. She walked through the main entrance at 6 in the evening in borrowed flat shoes and a dress that had been through 36 hours, and looked it. And the man at the door held it open for her with the same practiced professional courtesy he'd extended to every person who'd come through it that day. And she walked to the coat check and showed her ID, which she'd had in a small inner pocket of the dress the entire time, a habit from years of working events where her bag might be left at a table, and retrieved her handbag. Her phone had 17 missed calls, 4 from Gerald Whitmore, several from colleagues, 2 from a number she didn't recognize that she would look at later. 1 from her sister in Philadelphia, which meant the family network had activated somehow, which was a conversation she'd have to manage. She turned the phone over in her hand, stood in the lobby of the Aldrich Grand with her handbag on her shoulder and her borrowed shoes on the marble floor, and looked at the corridor that led to the ballroom. She walked down it. The ballroom was set up for a different event, a corporate something, round tables with different linen, different flowers. The room entirely reinvented in less than 48 hours the way hotel ballrooms were reinvented. Her shoes from the night before were gone. Whatever service staff had found them had disposed of them or kept them, or logged them in some lost and found that she'd never follow up with. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. The jazz quartet's chairs were still in the northeast corner, empty now. The floor where she'd walked 3 circuits and stood near the windows and felt the cold pressure between her shoulder blades was covered in new linen and different light. She stood there for 60 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back through the lobby and out the front door and down the steps to the street and into the city. Posset. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, which should have been obvious. 36 hours was not a long time in the life of an empty apartment, but which still landed with a specific strange weight when she unlocked the door and pushed it open and stood in the entrance looking at her own space. Her coat on the hook, her books on the shelf she'd built herself on a Saturday last November, the shelf being slightly crooked because she'd started without measuring and committed to it anyway rather than start over. A coffee mug on the drying rack she'd washed before she left and never put away. Small, ordinary, hers. She put her bag down, took off the borrowed shoes, stood on her own floor in bare feet for the second time in 36 hours, and felt the difference between the 2 times. The cold marble of the hotel corridor, the run and the terror and the specific gamble of an elevator door, and this floor, her floor, warm and familiar, and the texture of something she had built deliberately after leaving a place that had stopped being safe. She sat down on the couch. She sat there for a while without doing anything. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Cassian. Not his name. She hadn't put his name in her phone because she hadn't had her phone in the last 36 hours, and they'd communicated through his systems. The number she'd seen on the workstation. She'd logged it from memory on the subway ride home, which was either practical or something else. The message was 3 words. Confirmation just came through. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the laptop. Her own laptop, retrieved from her bag. Her own machine with her own files and her own wallpaper. A photograph she'd taken from the top of a building in Chicago the year she'd cracked the biggest case of her career and stood on a roof in November and thought that she might actually be good at this, actually capable of building something. And she logged into the secure server access she'd set up that morning from memory and reset the upload timer. She watched the confirmation screen. The documentation was still there, preserved, sealed. Everything she'd built in 36 hours of work that had been the most focused and the most dangerous and the most honest work she'd done in years, because there had been no room in any of it for anything other than exactly what was true. She thought about what Sabo had said. "You're in an interesting position, Ms. Hartwell." She'd said she wasn't working for Cassian. She'd meant it when she said it. She still meant it. But she sat on her couch in her apartment with her laptop open and thought about the specific shape of the last 36 hours, the things she'd been able to do inside them, the person she'd had to be. Not the person she'd been performing since leaving Brandon, the careful, reconstructed, vigilant person who changed her routes and watched her back and kept her world small to keep it safe. But the person she'd been before all of that, the one who stood on a Chicago rooftop in November and felt capable. She hadn't felt that person in a long time. She picked up her phone. She looked at the message for another moment. Then she typed back, "Timer reset. 72 hours. She gave herself 60 seconds to wonder what she was doing. Then she typed a second message, "I have questions. Not tonight. When I'm ready." She put the phone down. She got up and went to her kitchen and made coffee. Real coffee, the way she actually drank it, with too much cream and no apology for it. And she stood at her window and looked out at the street below. The Upper West Side doing its Sunday evening. Couples and dog walkers and a bodega with its lights on and a man selling books from a folding table on the corner who was packing up for the night. Her phone buzzed once more. She looked at it. "Whenever you're ready." She set the phone on the counter. She drank her coffee. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening with the complete, beautiful indifference of 8 million people who had their own lives and their own corridors and their own moments of standing in an elevator and making a choice and living with what the choice became. She thought about what the choice had become. A federal inquiry with her name coming off it. Documentation that protected her sitting in a sealed archive. A man in a brownstone in Brooklyn who knew her subway route home and had, for whatever combination of reasons, said yes when she told him not to manage her. A career intact. A name that still meant something. And a question she hadn't asked yet and wasn't ready to ask yet, and that would wait, because the things worth understanding usually required time, and she was a person who had learned at considerable cost to take it. She rinsed her cup. She looked at her crooked shelf of books. She looked at her coat on the hook and her borrowed shoes by the door, and her own shoes, presumably still somewhere in the Aldrich Grand's lost and found, which she would call about tomorrow during business hours like a person conducting their life rather than surviving it. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming. And when morning came through the window and laid itself across the floor of her apartment in long, ordinary rectangles of light, she lay there for a moment before getting up and felt the specific, quiet weight of a person who had come through something and was still here. Still exactly themselves, damaged in old places and new ones, capable in ways she'd forgotten. Standing, or lying, technically, in her own bed in her own apartment with the morning coming in, on the other side of a choice that had started in a hotel elevator and ended somewhere much larger. She got up, made coffee, opened her laptop, started working. Not on the network. Not on documentation for anyone else's crisis or protection. On her own cases, the 7 active files from Whitmore Forensic Partners, the work she was paid to do with the expertise she'd spent 11 years building and that belonged to her, had always belonged to her, regardless of what anyone had tried to do with it. She worked for 2 hours before her phone rang, not Cassian. Gerald Whitmore, whose name she'd been avoiding for 36 hours and couldn't avoid indefinitely. She answered it. "Gerald." "Nyla." His voice had the same careful flatness as always, but there was something underneath it today. Something she recognized from the dozens of high-stakes deposition calls she'd been on with him, the specific quality of a man bracing himself for information he already suspects he has. "I need to explain some things," she said. "I imagine you do." A pause. "Are you all right?" The question surprised her. Gerald Whitmore did not typically lead with that question. He led with exposure assessments and liability reviews and the calculated management of professional reputation. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "I'm all right." "Good." Another pause. "Then explain." She explained. Not all of it. There were elements that were not Gerald's to know and that she would not give him. But the shape of it, the credential theft, the federal inquiry, the documentation she'd built and what it established, the status of her name in the investigation. She told it clean and factual and in sequence, the way she told everything, and when she was done, Gerald was quiet for a long moment. "The federal contact," he said. "The confirmation that your name is being removed. Processing. I'll have documentation within 36 hours. I want a copy when it's final. You'll have it. Nyla." His voice changed, very slightly. "The work you described, the network architecture, the counter-documentation, the—" He stopped, chose his words. "It's significant work." "Yes," she said simply. "Under considerable duress." "Yes. Whitmore Forensic Partners has a conflict of interest policy that technically, I know the policy, Gerald. I'm not invoking it." His voice was flat again, but flat in a different direction. "I'm observing that it technically applies and that I'm choosing not to invoke it because the work you've described, the outcome you've produced, is exactly the kind of work that justifies the judgment calls you made." A pause. "We'll discuss the full situation this week." "Tuesday," she said. "My schedule is clear." "Tuesday," he said. And then, in the voice of a man unused to the sentence, "I'm glad you're all right." He hung up. She put the phone down and looked out the window. The morning was full now. The city running its Monday with full commitment, people and traffic and noise, and the particular ambient hum of 8 million lives in motion. She was part of it again, in the way she'd been part of it before 36 hours ago, except that she was not exactly the same person who had put on a burgundy dress and gone to a charity gala to satisfy Gerald Whitmore's attendance requirements. She wasn't sure yet what was different. She suspected it would take time to map. Her phone lit up on the counter. She glanced at it without picking it up. A message from the number she'd logged from memory on the G train. "There's a proposal I'd like to discuss." "Not tonight. When you're ready, no pressure and no timeline." She looked at the message. She thought about it. The proposal she already understood the outlines of, the scale of what he was describing, the particular danger of walking toward something because it was compelling rather than away from something because it was frightening. She understood the difference between those two directions, and she understood that she'd spent too long doing the second one to commit immediately to the first without thinking carefully. She also thought about the shelf on her wall, slightly crooked, built on a Saturday by a person who had committed to the angle rather than start over. Some choices you made before you had all the information. The question was whether you made them from fear or from something else. She set her phone down without responding. She turned back to her laptop. She worked through the morning. Around noon, she ate something. Around 2, she called her sister in Philadelphia and had a conversation that was true in outline and partial in detail, and that her sister, who was practical and perceptive and who had always understood the difference between what Nyla said and what Nyla meant, accepted with the grace of someone who knew she'd get the rest of it eventually. At 4 in the afternoon, the federal confirmation came through. A message from Gerald's legal contact, the official one, routed through proper channels, formatted in the specific bureaucratic language of an inquiry update. Her name, the status change, clean and final and documented. She sat with it for a moment. 36 hours ago, she'd been standing in an elevator corridor in bare feet, with the sound of footsteps behind her and the specific terror of a person who had been running so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to stop. She forwarded the confirmation to Gerald. She saved a copy to 3 separate secure servers, and then she picked up her phone and typed a message to the number she'd logged from memory on the G train. The confirmation came through. "When you want to discuss the proposal, I'm available." She paused, then added, "Come to me." I picked the place. She put the phone down, picked up her coffee, stood at the window and looked out at the city. Wide and complicated and indifferent and full, impossibly full, of ordinary people doing ordinary things in lives that contain their own private disasters and recoveries and choices made in corridors with no shoes and no phone and nothing to rely on but the particular undestroyable fact of who they were. The response came in under a minute. "Your call." She smiled. Not the suggested smile she'd seen on him, not the brief cold flash of it. A real one, small and private and hers. Outside, the city moved, and Nyla Hartwell stood in her apartment on her own floor, in her own light, and let it.